Keep the orcs at bay. I need more time.
Let the numberless horde come.
Riv? Check. Orcs? Check. Need one thing out of the other? Double check. Let's do this!
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, I am SocioPsycho, and today we take a look at Orcs Must Die 2, created by Robot Entertainment. Now this is a tower defense game with some minor strategy put into a third-person perspective with some very well incorporated co-op playability. When we start off and we go into the options menu, you have your simple gameplay options, your sensitivity, invert, gore, and ragdoll capability. Pretty standard stuff. It's definitely nice to see options being very varied in that game. Now when we go into sound, it's nice to see that all of the options are split up on different sound sliders. The music is very well done and keeps through the entire course of the game, so you always feel like there's this purpose or call to arms, and it fits very well with the interactions of what happens in the game. It managed to piece the music with the gameplay seamlessly. Your effects and voice volume. Now there is voice acting in the game. While the story is not overly large, it is enough to tie the world together in a reasonable fashion. The majority of the voice acting comes from the dialogue that your character says, one-liners here and there, upon killing a monster in some fashion, which will make you smile now and again. When we go into video, you have a large variation of screen resolutions, different graphic detail options. Now the game graphically is very basic, so you don't have too much options here, but I've never ran into any performance, nor does the game look bad by any stretch. It's been running at 60 frames per second with no issues, and I've noticed that it can get up to around 90, but 60 it stays at just fine. I have noticed no tearing, clipping, or crashing of any sort, and I've never had a performance issue from the game. In co-op, now and again there may be latency, but that's hardly to blame on the game. Then you have your key bindings. They have your secondary and primary, which is definitely nice to have, and you can easily rebind all the keys without an issue. So it's really nice that they've incorporated this aspect into the game. So as you can see, the options menu has everything it needs. It has plenty of bulk for what the game has to offer. Now when you start up, there is a small variation in between the choice you have to pick in between a character. You can either go the sorcerer or the warrior knight. This is tied into the story because in the first game you played as the warrior and the story wrapped around that. In the second one it expands a little bit more and it adds a new character for playability. The difference in between the two characters though is very small. You have the sorceress who has a magical wand who's able to charm creatures and has a power attack that you can build up to a little bit of a larger blast radius, as well as she has a ice trap that's not available if you play as the warrior knight. She is also able, when she jumps, to sort of levitate herself over certain areas because she's more magically based. Where the knight has tar pits, which are actually a very nice trap, as they slow the enemies through and they last a long time before they have to recharge. And he also has a blunderbuss, which is a ranged weapon with a alternative stun mode and knockback of the enemies. So they each have their own different characteristic, and it adds a little bit to the playstyle. Now none of these weapons are set in stone, and we'll go into that in a moment. So when we go into the game itself, there is a lot to talk about. And the first thing to talk about is the spellbook, because by understanding the spells first, then you'll understand how some of those spells, keep one or two of them in your mind, how they relate into level design later on. The whole goal is to gain skulls. You gain skulls through two methods. One, when you complete a level, you have a chance to get 5 skulls from that level by completing it in the par time needed, and not letting any enemies through your defenses. The other way to get skulls is the higher combos you get upon enemies, and you gain combos by hitting enemies with multiple types of weaponry. When they die, there will be a greater chance of them dropping a skull. The gear is well balanced out in between how the levels scale and how you gain currency, to where you don't feel like you're behind the time or, oh well, if I get that one trap then I'll be set. You play enough and you'll get them pretty easily. I never felt like I needed to grind for skulls, and when we go into the actual gear, it's broken up by the different types. Now you have your basic traps, and when we look through the list in my book here, you have a bunch, and they'll each cost a different amount of skulls to unlock, but then once you unlock them, they're yours permanently. So we have Brimstone here, Floor Trap, burns enemies, fades out after doing damage, recharges over time. Now, every trap has an ability tied to it, but you can only select one. So as you see here, I changed that. Enemies set on fire burn longer, where Brimstone heats up faster. So you can do more damage to a group of enemies, or you can have it heat up faster so it sort of recharges faster so you can hit the next wave faster. There's a large variation of different types of traps when it comes to what you have available, and they all really tie well into how the levels are designed. In an area where a grinder will be useful, you might not have a space on the wall to place it. So on one map it's highly terrific to have, and on another map it's kind of useless. So due to the level design, the majority of the traps do feel actually useful. They have their place, and it's up to you to experiment in between what you like, what you want to make work, to try to find out how to use these different traps to deploy in a battle. And you have the same thing with weaponry. Now, weaponry is like traps. You have a choice to take into battle with you when you enter a level upon what type of gear loadout you want to take, but then you can't switch it up, so you need to be sure you're taking into battle what you want to take into battle. And what different types of weapons you decide to play with really shape your experience. It does make a huge difference. The different types of enemies you face in between the different types of weapons you take into battle make a huge difference. Whether you want a bone amulet, which for bonus power is to summon a bone golem, so that way you have a sort of tank or a distraction at the very least. Or if you want something more damage causing like a flame bracelet that throws fireballs at the enemy and spreads to other enemies and does burning damage. Or summon a wall of flame, which when they walk through it, they take massive amount of damage. So there's a large variation between the different weapons that you get the option to play more your style, so you can tone the types of traps you take into battle to complement you upon what type of weapons you take. And then the same thing with trinkets. If you are going for more of a melee class build, and your traps are set up to support that, then getting something as a defense trinket would make more sense, or a freedom trinket which resists stuns. As you can see, these have passive abilities as well. Active ability also clears chill and slow effects, and active abilities apply to being frozen as well, so it resists those abilities. So there's different items you can have to customize your playstyle even more, and you have to keep in mind, due to the different level layouts, that not every preferred layout is going to be optimized to handle every single different level. And then the last tab, we just have your skins. So let's talk about level design, because that's really where the game is. As a tower defense game, it's important to have the right style of level. And first I want to show the level of depth that you have potentially available. And some of this is because of DLC, such as Fire and Water, Family Ties, and Are We There Yeti. Those 3 are DLC, but you get these other 4. You have your story base, which is Orcs Must Die 2, and it has plenty of missions on that front. You have Endless Wave, which just continues to rack up a numerous amount of troops until you are overwhelmed. In Endless Mode, the enemies get stronger and stronger, so where the weakest enemy you could kill in 1 hit, at round 45, that enemy might take 3 hits. So it really comes down to how far can you get and how far can you improve your score, which ties into the leaderboards, as there is a large leaderboard subject, and we'll go into that in a moment here. You also have your Classic, which are maps from Orcs Must Die 1 transmitted over into the second game. It doesn't represent the first game as good, but it does offer more content, which is nice. It sort of says, hey, look, here are levels from the first game, but the first game definitely had a difficulty which was a lot greater than this one. And you also have weekly challenge, which every week they come out with a new challenge, and when you play it, you are forced with a predetermined selection, and you have to try to get through that selection, whether it be 2 items or 4 items or 1 item, and different types of enemies will come out that they have crafted so that you can beat it, but it will be a lot more difficult or perhaps even uncomfortable to do so. Now, I did talk about difficulty very briefly, and you have 3 modes. You have Apprentice Mode, War Mage, and Nightmare. This will affect the amount of troops that come out in the levels, as well as the amount of difficulty that you face. An enemy will hit you harder, and there'll be more of them, which really goes into leaderboards. Now, I'm not much of a competitional person, but there is a large variable for people who want to play in a leaderboard fashion. So many people have played this. I'm 68,000. And it's tied very easily into the game to find the level that you're looking for to compete your score with, the difficulty, or if you just want to compete against your friends, it's very obvious and easy to find those, and it kind of gives you an encourage to play more, or be like, hey, why don't you come against this guy or fight more of this, because you don't want to be on the lower end, do you, against your friends or whatever the case may be. Well, one issue I do have though with this UI is the fact that when you switch in between these levels, on the side there is no map. So if you already played all these and you're looking for playing that one, and you're like, wait, which map was that one that I like to play on? It would be nice if above leaderboards, they screwed leaderboards down a little bit and moved an image and showed what the map looked like. Now we're going to go over the layout first, because the level design layout is very important upon how this plays out. So we're going to start off here with a smaller map, and as you can see, it's smaller, it's easier, it's more welcoming, so it starts you off on a nice slow pace, and it will slowly progress you into a larger and more complicated level design. Different zones have different interactional objects, whether it be other sorts of traps, or different paths where they have barricades, and you sort of need to feel out the best way to stop the enemy from progressing. Maybe you should just cut the barricades and try to funnel them all into one area. But if you do that and sappers come out, which are explosive creatures, they'll blow right through your barricades, and then you'll be at a disadvantage. The level design is split up very well. You have to continuously be on your toes, and that's where the small strategy aspect of the game comes in from. Because you have to be aware of what you're doing and how you're playing, and your surroundings more importantly, the better you're able to do that, the better you'll be and able to handle the threat that does come at you. Because the levels do get larger in their complexity. It doesn't mean that it's going to take you 20 minutes to get from one side of the map to the other. They don't get ridiculously large in size, just for complexity. The gate you need to protect, instead of being a straight path, well, now enemies will be able to come from behind you, or they're flying in through a certain fashion to get into your portal. So you need to make sure that you have your bases covered, and you have a strategy to a point. Now, some of this does come down to understanding what the enemy is going to throw at you, and more importantly, what the enemy is. And you can see what the enemy is going to throw against you. We'll go into that in a moment. But the level designs continuously get more intricate as you play through. And as you can see, we have doors that are shaking and busting. This means that this will be the first door to be knocked open. And if you have multiple entrances on a map, when you see a door like that starting to bust, that means next round it's going to pop, and that's going to be one more pathway that you're going to have to worry about. And no doubt you've seen these blue lines going everywhere. That is just a representation of where the enemy monsters are going to come. Now, if you put up barricades, that will change. Another aspect, because how the levels do increase in their size, and it's very important to be able to move around the map fast, they have portals that you can use that will teleport you to the other side. Something you need to be careful about, because if you portal right into a whole herd of enemies and you get hit and killed, you're not doing anybody any favors. because of how the level designs are split up. It's very important to understand what your traps do and where the enemies are moving so you can manipulate them to your best ability. Now, it doesn't mean that you'll be able to manipulate the enemy in the most easiest of fashion and you'll be like, oh wow, I just nerfed the game. It never felt like that. It always has enough to where it's a challenge, especially if you do it on a co-op mode, because a co-op mode is going to increase the amount of troops that come out to make it fair for the fact that there are 2 people. But as you can see on this map, if we place down barricades, we can redirect the movement path of the enemy. But we need to make sure that we're very careful in how we do that. So if we don't place down the barricades in the right spot, then we're not going to optimize how we have the enemy moving through. And it will put more stress or pressure perhaps in one location, but it's all about making a gauntlet. If you're able to force the majority of your troops down one pathway, and that pathway you put a lot of your money into fortifying with traps, you're going to be able to destroy a lot more of the bulk forces that make up the enemy attack. Which brings us really into the monsters. Now the monsters are split up by different characteristics. You have, obviously the game is about defeating orcs and protecting your portal or end gate from being overrun. Now this is monitored by the fact that on the top right hand side you have a number, and those are your rift points. The more enemies or stronger enemies that make it through, they'll take away from your points. So you have your basic orcs, which come out in hordes. They're very easy to dispatch, but they come out with so many, and you have different variations of those basic orcs. You have your no armor, and then you have your medium armor and your heavy armor. The styles of orcs that they have on the grunt level is very simplistic. What you need to look out for is more of the crossbow orcs, which are ranged and will do damage to you if you allow them to. And when talking about ranged creatures, I feel the most dangerous creature in the game is actually the mage. There is an enemy orc shaman whose magical attack will seek you out, and you have to dodge it in a very specific fashion. They can be very dangerous to deal with. In between those dangers and the kobolds, you have to look out for these guys because they will run very fast and try to make it through your portal and take away your points or activate your traps. So a larger trap you have, which is really good for taking out stronger, bigger opponents, gets triggered by a smaller guy, so now it's on cooldown and a big guy walks right through it without getting any damage. So it all balances together and plays very well. And I won't be able to show you all of these monsters during one single video. That's why I'm going over the different creatures in the game, because it's very important to actually give you this information so you can see not only the animational quality and the character quality graphically, but also the fact that there is a lot of variation. Whether it be null hunters, which are really fast and will poison and slow you and can easily kill you, or if it's something like a frost ogre, which if you have a frost trap they're completely immune to, just as a fire ogre will be immune to fire traps. So one of those guys walking through all your traps will trigger them all, depending on which one they are, not take any damage, and then everyone else behind them doesn't take any damage because the trap's resetting. So there is a certain awareness you need to be in order to actually take out the enemies and place some traps in order to handle that which the different levels are going to send against you. Whether it just be a bunch of small orcs or the occasional larger armored orc, which is going to take a lot of damage, you have to be aware of what these creatures do and able to handle them. As you can see, the bigger guys will easily stun you if you give them the option or chance by getting that close. Now there is a trinket like we went over to prevent you from getting stunned, but if you don't have that, it can mean that you die pretty easily. And they also have a lot of trolls. Trolls regenerate health and they have different variables. They got weaker trolls, stronger trolls, and giant trolls, or mountain trolls I believe they're called. And they can end up taking a lot of damage, so you need to be careful about how you deal with them. In the regular game, they're pretty easy to manage, but once you start going into difficult versions such as Endless, it does get a little bit hectic or crazy. As I said, the difficulty in the second game is nowhere near how hard it was in the first, so it's not something that without the correct layout that you can't handle. But there are a large variation of different monsters that you need to be aware of, because the game does rely on understanding what the enemies do. That way you can know how you can defeat them. So when it comes down to combat itself, when we get to the meat of the game, how does it play? So let's jump into an actual game and show you exactly that. Now, on the top left corner, you can see that there is a mana bar, which is blue, for casting all your spells or using special items. And you have a health bar. On the right side, you have your map, so you can get an understanding of what's going on. And in this one, you can see they've gave us some basic troops, some archers, as there will be air units on this map. Now, I am playing on Nightmare in this game, but this is a smaller level, so it's not going to be anything overly dramatic. And I thought that bringing it into a smaller, easier looking level would make it so people wouldn't be turned off, wouldn't be like, oh wow, that looks way too intense. Because the game does have a large variation of difficulties, I'm attempting to find that middle ground. When you hit the B button, it'll bring up your spellbook. It's very important to select the correct weapons and traps that you want, because once you actually start the battle, you're not going to be able to backtrack and select other traps or abilities. And as you can see, there is 10 abilities available to you, but when you play in co-op mode, you only have availability of 5. So again, it's important to select what you really want to take into battle. And I like this fact that once you make your choice and your preference, you're stuck with it. So if you make it a bad one, if it's completely not salvageable, then okay, you need to redo. But if you just made a tiny mistake, then hey, you know what, you need to just roll with it and try to get through the best you can. When we look into the spellbook, you can also see the different types of enemies that are coming up. And we went over the creatures very basically, but there's also flyers in this one. So this is where you can see the enemies that are coming, so you can sort of plan what you're going to be able to facing. It's very easy level troops on this map, and it should not be an issue, but I will show you there are kobold sappers which blow up, and if they touch you, they'll kill you, or if they touch your structures like barricades, they'll kill the barricades. Traps don't get damaged by enemies. They just have a cooldown, they'll attack, and then they'll run out of ammunition, and they'll need time to replenish before they're able to attack again. But barricades don't do anything outside of stopping the direction of the enemy wants to go in. So if we cut off one side of a map here, as you can see, in this case it will allow the enemies to move to the other lane to try to get through. But if I closed off all lanes, then the enemies would just go straight for the barricades and try to destroy them without taking the pathing into consideration. And the pathing of the AI is actually done very well. I have never had an issue with the direction that the enemies go because of how I laid out my traps. Is the game difficult in some fashions because of what you end up facing? Perhaps, but I never felt like the AI was screwing me over or not correctly working as it was intended. Some variation in how the movements of the troops or attacking. I never had an issue in that regard. So it's up to you to decide what types of traps you want to place down, and more importantly, what abilities you want to use. As you can see here, you have the different options to be able to funnel your enemies in different manners. And when you hit your enemy with different types of traps, combos increase, and when you increase in those combos, you have a greater chance of a skull dropping, which we went into earlier, which is your currency. Now also, as you've noticed, that the traps that you place down do cost money, and every kill will give you money, and there is a money trinket to increase for a short time how much the kills are worth, and when they die, a coin drops. The passive is just an increased chance of a coin drop. So it is somewhat about money management and placing down the right traps in the right order, but it comes down also to your enjoyment and trying to figure out a way to defeat your enemies without having too much of an issue. Because one size won't fit for every level, as we've showed you, levels look dramatically different. There was never a feeling of repetitiveness based off of how the levels look or played. And how they tie together what enemies you face also makes a very large difference. Because on one map where you're facing a whole flood of weaker but smaller guys, perhaps that's a smaller map and the whole point is for them to try to rush you by just overwhelming you. Where on another larger map where you have a little bit more breathing room, they'll send in a lot of small guys to weaken your traps down, but then behind it they'll send in a bunch of larger guys such as armored ogres or giant trolls, whatever the case is, to really try to add into the oh crap quality of the game. But it's all very balanced fairly, and it could easily be said that the balancing of the game is too easy because of it. And if you're not aware of what the enemy is going to do or how the enemy is going to attack, they can easily destroy your fortifications, such as barricades, and if that happens, if that becomes the case, then you end up losing all of that money, and more importantly, falling potentially behind in your defense, and making it harder for you to catch up economically and combat-wise. So it's important, if you have a bunch of sappers coming out, you're aware of where the sappers are going to go, and if they can get to you, they are going to get to you, but if there are barricades closer, then they're going to go to the barricades. The difficulty in the game is enough for people who are new to it. There are large variations to where it will be very satisfying for people new to either this sort of combat perspective or this style of game, whether it be the strategic element or the combat element of it. They'll be able to actually have the availability and choice. Where it kind of falls short though is in the offering of more skilled players. Now that can also be partly made up in the fact that, well, if you want more of a skill, go into leaderboards. But me personally, I'm not a very competitive person, and so leaderboards, while they're nice to have in games like this, don't do anything for me personally. I enjoy more of a challenge against a really strong opponent, or unfair odds even, fighting enemies I shouldn't be fighting at my current level or skill or whatever the case may be, and I feel that this game really lacks in that capability. Now, if you do play in co-op, it does offer a little bit more because it increases the size where the enemies come out, because it's saying, hey, you have 2 players, that means you're going to have double the traps, and you have 2 people participating in taking out all these monsters with abilities and whatnot. So it increases the amount of troops it has, but it lacks a certain push to the brink in difficulty for people who find Nightmare to be too easy, such as me. And while they do have the endless option to continuously play the game in an endless mode, it doesn't really fill that gap because it gets kind of dulling. The enemy just increases in their armor and their strength to a point where your traps really end up not being all that useful, and it feels more like a time dump. Because that happens, you end up losing the satisfaction of the kill. The enemy becomes too annoying or too difficult to end up killing, and you have to resort to cheap tricks or some variation in order to defeat the enemies on a higher endless level, past 60 or so. As you can see here in the top corner, there are only 9 levels to this mission, but on an endless you go until you die, and as I said, they increase in armor and health, so after you get pretty high up, it gets harder to take them out. But that doesn't relate to increasing the challenge overall, because while the game itself is very satisfying, in between how the enemies die, the sounds they make, the enjoyment of watching a creature fly apart, or how heavy and satisfying the traps are and how well they work in correlation to all of your abilities, sometimes it does feel a little lacking for the harder core players. But there's still enjoyment to be had in the game. It's not that there isn't enjoyment, and I know I might have been rambling on about this a little longer than I should be, but because it plays as enjoyable as it does, I would have liked to see a bit more of a challenge aspect for the player. So at the end, the game is very satisfying. The combat feels heavy. The enemy, different types and variations, are good enough to last as a challenge for anybody new or moderate or even hardcore for this game. The sound quality and animational quality are terrific. The enjoyment that you can find in playing with somebody else in a co-op mode only increases the value of the game. So at the end of the day, it's a very easy recommend. I don't have any issues or problems actually recommending this game. I found it very entertaining and very fun to play. And for the simple price of $15 for how much time I got out of it, yeah, definitely. So thank you everybody for listening and watching, for I've been SocioPsycho, and I'll see you next time.